So, my girlfriend Emma and I had just moved into this old house a couple of months ago. It wasn't a dream home or anything, but it was cheap, and we needed the space. The housing market had been brutal, and when this place popped up at a price we couldn't believe, we jumped on it. It was an old 2-story Victorian on the edge of town, with peeling white paint, a rickety front porch, and one of those turret-style towers that screamed fixer-upper. The place came as is, which included all the furniture and belongings of the previous owner, an eccentric old man named Mr. Crenshaw, who'd passed away under mysterious circumstances. The realtor brushed it off, saying he was just a recluse who'd lived alone for decades. Still, walking into the house for the first time felt strange. The air was heavy, and there was this faint musty smell, like old books mixed with something metallic. Emma called it charm. I called it creepy. The first day was spent hauling in boxes and trying to figure out what to do with all the old stuff Mr. Crenshaw had left behind. The living room had this massive, dusty couch with clawed feet and upholstery that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 70s. There was also a grandfather clock in the corner that didn't work, but still ticked occasionally, which we decided to leave for now because it was too heavy to move. Upstairs, the bedrooms were small but cozy, each with an assortment of mismatched furniture. Our room had an antique wardrobe that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. Emma thought it was quaint, but I couldn't help imagining something sinister lurking inside. I checked it 3 times before I finally felt okay about sleeping in the same room with it. The kitchen was functional but outdated, with avocado green appliances that looked straight out of the 1970s. There was a table with a wobbly leg and a collection of mismatched chairs, and every cabinet was crammed with ancient cans of food and dusty jars of spices. We joked about finding treasure, but mostly found cobwebs and a few dead bugs. Then there was the basement. The door to it was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, almost as if it was trying to hide. It was painted this sickly green color, and the wood looked warped and splintered around the edges. When I tried to open it, the door groaned like it hadn't been moved in years. Emma joked that we'd found the entrance to Narnia, but I didn't laugh. Something about that door gave me the creeps. We decided to leave it alone for the time being and focus on the upstairs. By the time we were done unpacking, the sun had set, and the house felt completely different. Shadows stretched across the walls, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. We tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling, but I could tell Emma was a little on edge too. Still, we were exhausted, and there was no way we were going to let our imaginations ruin our first night in our new home. As we lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't anything specific, just this sense of being watched. Emma fell asleep almost immediately, but I stayed awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling and listening to the faint hum of the grandfather clock downstairs. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just nerves and drifted off to sleep. Looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention to that feeling. The first thing I noticed about the basement door was how out of place it seemed. While every other door in the house was worn but functional, this one looked like it had been fighting to stay shut for decades. The peeling green paint gave it a sickly, almost rotting appearance, and deep gouges marred the wood around the handle, like someone, or something, had tried to claw their way in, or out. Emma laughed when I pointed it out. It's an old house, "Everything's bound to look a little creepy," she said, brushing past me with an armful of boxes. "Just think of it as character." But the door felt different. Even standing near it, the air seemed heavier, warmer. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe bad ventilation, and got back to unpacking. Later that evening, while Emma was arranging some books on the living room shelf, I decided to take another look. I pulled on the handle, and the door groaned like a living thing, resisting me. It wasn't locked, but it didn't open easily either. Finally, it gave way, revealing a steep staircase that disappeared into darkness. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of damp earth and something sour, almost metallic. I coughed and stepped back. "Don't tell me you're going down there," Emma called from the living room, clearly amused. "Just looking," I replied, although even that felt like a bad idea. The light switch at the top of the stairs didn't work, and the darkness felt wrong. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing against the edges of my vision. I took a single step down, and the wood creaked loudly under my weight. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on wood, coming from somewhere below. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but my heart was already racing. "Okay, nope," I muttered, slamming the door shut and turning the old iron key in the lock. Whatever was down there could stay down there. Emma looked over at me and rolled her eyes. "You're such a baby," she teased, but I could see the unease in her smile. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the door. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sounded like something moving on the other side of it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, it's just a basement, right? I wish I'd trusted my gut. A couple of weeks after moving in, Emma and I started noticing this smell. It wasn't constant, but when it hit, it was awful, pungent and sour, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. Emma thought it might be mold, or maybe a dead animal trapped somewhere in the walls. I wasn't so sure. The weird thing was, the smell always seemed to come from near the basement door. Sometimes it would waft into the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Other times, it would hit like a wall, thick and choking, forcing us to open windows just to breathe. I tried to track it down, but no matter how close I got to the door, the smell seemed to retreat, like it didn't want to be found. It was maddening. "It's probably just bad plumbing," Emma said one night as we ate dinner. She was trying to sound casual, but I could tell she was bothered. The smell had been getting worse. I told her I'd call a plumber in the morning, but deep down, I wasn't convinced it was something so simple. The smell didn't feel natural. That night, the smell hit again, stronger than ever. I was lying in bed when it seemed to seep under the bedroom door, like it had a mind of its own. I gagged and nudged Emma awake. "Do you smell that?" I whispered. She groaned, half asleep, and muttered something about it being in my head. But it wasn't. It was so strong I felt like it was crawling into my lungs. It made my skin prickle, like something was wrong on a level I couldn't explain. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the hallway. The smell was suffocating near the basement door, almost like it was emanating from the cracks around the edges. I leaned in closer, holding my breath. And that's when I heard it. A faint, wet sound, like something shifting on the other side. It wasn't just the sound. It felt like there was movement, deliberate and alive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but instead I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then Emma called out from the bedroom, her voice groggy and annoyed. "What are you doing? Come back to bed." I snapped out of it and stumbled back down the hall, my heart racing. "Nothing," I muttered, trying to sound calm. Emma fell back asleep almost instantly, but I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, the smell was gone. It was as if nothing had happened, and Emma didn't even bring it up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting behind that door. Something that didn't want to be disturbed. Looking back, I should have opened that door right then and there. Or maybe it's a good thing I didn't. She was right. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Reluctantly, I followed her back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears and makes your skin crawl. I kept glancing at the bedroom door, half expecting it to creak open on its own. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. At one point, I thought I heard a faint creak in the hallway. My body went rigid, ears straining to catch any other sound. But there was nothing. Just silence. I stared at the ceiling until the first light of dawn broke through the curtains. And even then I couldn't shake the unease. The scratches on the door, the whispers, the pounding. It all felt too real to ignore. If I had known what was coming, I would never have gone back to bed. The next morning, the strange events of the night before felt like a bad dream. The daylight made the house feel almost normal, as though it couldn't possibly be the same place that had terrified me hours earlier. Emma seemed to have already forgotten about it. She was making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly to herself. I wanted to let it go too, but I couldn't. I needed to see the basement door in the light. As soon as Emma was preoccupied with her morning routine, I slipped into the hallway. The door looked the same as it had last night, warped green paint, splintered edges. But when I knelt down to look closer, my stomach twisted. The scratches were deeper than I remembered. Long, uneven grooves carved into the wood, as if some animal, no, something larger, had tried to claw its way out. I traced one of the marks with my finger, feeling the rough edges. It wasn't just the surface that was damaged. The gouges had gone deep, exposing raw wood beneath. I leaned in closer and noticed something else. Faint streaks of a dark reddish-brown substance around the edges of the scratches. My mind jumped to the worst conclusion, but I quickly shook it off. It had to be rust or old paint, I told myself. Nothing else made sense. "Are you seriously still obsessing over that door?" Emma's voice startled me, and I jumped to my feet. She was standing at the end of the hallway, a mug of coffee in her hand, her brow furrowed. "It's not just a door," I said, gesturing toward the scratches. "Look at this. Doesn't this seem wrong?" She walked over, taking a sip of her coffee before crouching down to inspect the marks. Her expression softened slightly, but she quickly shook her head. "It's just old," she said, standing up again. "Maybe there was a dog or something here before. You're overthinking it." I wanted to argue. but I could tell she wasn't in the mood for another conversation about the basement. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek and disappeared into the living room. I stayed by the door a little longer, staring at the scratches. They didn't look like the work of an animal to me. They were too erratic, too desperate. And there was the matter of the reddish streaks. No, I wasn't going to let this go. I made up my mind to investigate further. Grabbing a screwdriver from the kitchen, I knelt back down and began removing the screws from the lock. If Emma wasn't going to take this seriously, I'd figure it out myself. The lock came off easily enough, and I pulled the door open. A rush of cold, damp air hit me like a slap to the face. The smell was back too, stronger than before. It made my eyes water, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs, illuminating the steep descent into darkness. The beam of light barely reached the bottom, but what I could see sent my heart racing. The walls of the staircase were lined with scratches, just like the door. Some were shallow, but others cut deep into the wood, creating a jagged, chaotic pattern that seemed to lead downward. My throat tightened. Something had been trying to get out. Or worse, trying to keep something else in. I slammed the door shut and reattached the lock as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly it took me twice as long as it should have. When I was done, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, everything okay?" Emma called from the living room. "Yeah," I lied, my voice barely steady. "Just checking something." The whispers began a few nights after I opened the basement door. At first, I wasn't sure if I was imagining them or if they were some trick of the wind. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became. They were real. It would start in the dead of night, when the house was completely silent. A faint, indistinct murmuring, almost like someone speaking just out of earshot. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. But when I focused on it, it always led me back to the basement door. Emma didn't hear it, of course. Whenever I tried to point it out, she'd shake her head and tell me I was being paranoid. "It's an old house," she'd say, her tone more impatient each time. "Things creak and groan. You're letting your imagination run wild." But it wasn't my imagination. I knew that for sure the night I heard it while standing right next to the door. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water, trying to shake the restless feeling that had plagued me all evening. As I passed the hallway, I stopped in my tracks. The whispers were louder this time, urgent and garbled like a chorus of voices layered on top of one another. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, pleading, desperate. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the door. The wood was ice cold, and I swear I felt it vibrate under my fingers, like something was pressing against it from the other side. "Let me out." One voice finally broke through the noise, clear and unmistakable. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me, and I yanked my hand back as if I'd been burned. I stumbled back into the kitchen, breathing hard. My hands were shaking so badly that when I tried to fill my glass, I spilled water all over the counter. I didn't care. All I could think about was the voice. Let me out. Who was it? Or worse, what was it? I tried to tell Emma about it the next morning, but she barely listened. "You're hearing things," she said, brushing past me to grab her bag. "You've been stressed since we moved in. Just relax, okay?" She left for work without another word, leaving me alone with the house and its whispers. I spent most of the day trying to distract myself, but every time I walked past the basement door, I felt its presence. The whispers didn't come during the day, but the door seemed to hum with energy, like it was waiting for nightfall. That evening I decided to record it. If Emma wouldn't believe me, maybe I could prove it. I set up my phone on a stool in the hallway, aimed directly at the door, and pressed record. Then I went back to the bedroom, lying in the dark and staring at the ceiling, waiting for the whispers to begin. Hours passed. Just as I started to drift off, they came. Quiet at first, but growing louder with every passing minute. My heart raced as I crept back into the hallway, keeping my distance from the door. The phone was still recording, its tiny red light blinking in the dark. "Let me out," the voice came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like a low growl. My stomach dropped. The growl wasn't human. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. When I checked the recording the next morning, my heart sank. The whispers were there, faint but unmistakable. But the worst part wasn't the voices. It was the heavy breathing that came at the end, right before the recording cut out. Breathing that didn't belong to me or Emma. Whatever was in the basement, it wasn't just trying to get out. It was watching us. The tension between Emma and me had been building ever since the whispers started. She thought I was losing it, and I was beginning to wonder if she was right. But everything changed the day she decided to prove me wrong. It was a Saturday morning, bright and sunny, the kind of day that made the house's creeping dread seem almost absurd. Emma had been quietly watching me from the couch as I paced back and forth near the hallway. Finally, she sighed and set her coffee mug down. "All right," she said. "Let's settle this once and for all." I stopped pacing and stared at her. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the basement door. "I'm going down there." My stomach dropped. "Emma, no, that's..." "Enough," she snapped, cutting me off. "I'm tired of this. You've been freaking yourself out over nothing, and it's driving me insane. If I go down there and show you there's nothing to be afraid of, will you finally stop?" I wanted to stop her. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to grab her arm, to tell her she had no idea what she was getting herself into. But part of me hesitated. What if she was right? What if I really was imagining things? She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and then, after a moment's thought, grabbed her phone. "If it makes you feel better, I'll record everything. Then you can see for yourself." Before I could respond, she marched over to the basement door. Her movements were deliberate, almost defiant. When she pulled the lock off and opened the door, the familiar wave of cold, damp air rolled out, carrying that awful metallic smell. She wrinkled her nose but didn't hesitate. "Stay here," she said firmly, before descending into the darkness. "Emma, wait," I called after her, but she was already gone. The door creaked as it swung shut behind her, leaving me alone in the hallway. I stood there, frozen, listening to the faint sound of her footsteps disappearing down the stairs. Minutes passed. Each one felt like an hour. My chest tightened as I strained to hear something, anything from the basement. At first there was only silence. Then faintly I heard her voice. "It's just a basement," she called, her tone casual. "There's literally nothing down here but junk." Her words eased the tension in my chest, but only slightly. "Are you sure?" I called back. "Yes, I'm sure." she replied, exasperated. "I'm filming everything. You can watch it later and see for yourself." A few minutes later, her footsteps echoed back up the stairs. The door opened, and Emma emerged, looking mildly annoyed. "See?" she said, holding up her phone. "Nothing's wrong. It's just a creepy old basement." "Let's look at the footage," I said, "just to be sure." She sighed heavily, her frustration palpable. "You're still stuck on this? Fine. But I'm telling you, it's nothing." Her insistence was unnerving. As we sat on the couch, she kept glancing at me, her expression almost pleading. "You're overthinking it," she said. "It's just shadows, that's all." The video started with her descending the staircase, the flashlight beam bouncing slightly as she walked. The basement looked exactly how I remembered it: dusty shelves, cobwebs, and old tools scattered across the floor. Her narration was casual, almost bored. "This is what you're so scared of?" she said on the video, panning the camera around the room. "Nothing but a bunch of old junk." Toward the end of the video, as she was making her way back up the stairs, something caught my eye. Just for a split second, in the far corner of the screen, I saw what looked like the top of a forehead peeking out from behind one of the shelves. My heart sank. "Wait, pause it." Emma rolled her eyes but paused the video. "What?" I pointed at the screen. "Right there. Do you see that? Behind the shelf?" She squinted at the screen and shook her head. "It's nothing. Probably a shadow or some junk stacked weird. You're imagining things." "No," I said firmly. That's a face. Emma, I'm telling you, that's a face." She laughed nervously, grabbing my hand and squeezing it tightly. "It's not a face," she said, her voice firm but strained. "I was just down there. There's nothing to be afraid of. Please stop worrying about this." Her intensity caught me off guard. She was trying too hard to convince me, and it only made my unease grow. She leaned in, her eyes locked on mine, her voice soft but insistent. "It's nothing," she whispered. "You're safe." The house had gone quiet again, too quiet. I wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped me. It was almost desperate. "All right," I said finally, forcing a smile. "You're probably right." She smiled back, relieved, and disappeared into the kitchen. That night I couldn't sleep. I tried closing my eyes, focusing on the rhythmic sound of Emma's breathing beside me, but my mind kept wandering back to the video. The forehead, or whatever it was, lingered in my thoughts, taunting me with its brief appearance. Emma had brushed it off so easily, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Around 2 a.m., the house was silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears hum, the kind that presses against your skull. Then came the noise, a faint creak, almost imperceptible, followed by what sounded like a soft shuffle. My eyes snapped open. It was coming from the hallway. I turned my head toward Emma. She was fast asleep, her breathing steady and deep. For a moment I considered waking her, but something stopped me. I didn't want to hear her dismiss me again. Slowly I got out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight spilling through a window. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear the noise again. Another creak, louder this time, echoed from the direction of the basement door. My stomach churned, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me toward it. When I reached the door, the smell hit me. That familiar metallic, rotting odor. It was stronger than ever, as if the air itself was saturated with it. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something stronger, curiosity maybe, pushed me forward. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, revealing the yawning darkness of the basement. The smell intensified, making my eyes water. I aimed the flashlight down the stairs, the beam trembling as I held it. Nothing moved. The stairs stretched down into an abyss, their edges swallowed by shadows. Then, behind me, a voice. "What are you doing?" I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. Emma was standing there, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the hallway. My heart raced. "Emma," I stammered. "How did you get here?" She frowned, tilting her head. "What do you mean? I heard you get up. What's going on?" I stared at her, my mind struggling to process. I had left her in bed not 10 seconds ago. There was no way she could have followed me that quickly. It wasn't possible. "You were just..." I trailed off, pointing toward the bedroom. She gave me a concerned look. "Are you okay? You're acting weird. Let's go back to bed." "Emma, you were in bed. How did you get here so fast?" She sighed, stepping closer to me. Her voice was soft, soothing. "You're overtired. You've been so stressed about this house. Come on, let's get some sleep." I wanted to argue, to tell her what I'd seen, what I'd felt. But the way she looked at me, gentle, patient, made me hesitate. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was so on edge that my mind was playing tricks on me. "Okay," I said finally, lowering the flashlight. "You're probably right." She smiled and took my hand, guiding me back to the bedroom. As we lay down, she stroked my arm gently, murmuring reassurances until my breathing slowed. The next morning, Emma left for work as usual. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her bag, and was out the door by 8 a.m. I had some leftover vacation days, so I stayed behind, planning to spend the day doing absolutely nothing productive. I sank into the couch, flipping through TV channels, scrolling my phone, and generally wasting time. 7 hours passed in a blur, but the uneasy feeling in my chest never quite went away. Around 3 p.m., I couldn't shake it anymore. Something was pulling me toward the basement. The video from a few nights ago flashed in my mind. The whispers, the scratches, the forehead. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but my feet were already moving toward the hallway. The metallic smell hit me as soon as I opened the basement door. It was worse than ever, sharp and suffocating. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to go down. The stairs creaked under my weight, the air growing colder with every step. At the bottom, I swept my flashlight across the room. The shelves were lined with dusty jars and forgotten tools, just as Emma had shown in the video. But then I saw her. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Near the far wall, slumped against a support beam, was Emma. My heart stopped. Her face was barely recognizable, swollen and covered in deep purple bruises. One eye was almost completely shut, her lips cracked and bleeding. Cuts crisscrossed her arms and legs, the wounds red and raw, as if something had been clawing at her. Her hair was a tangled, filthy mess, plastered to her face with sweat. Her skin was pallid, with a sickly blue tint that made her look more corpse than human. I rushed to her, dropping to my knees. "Emma, oh my God, what happened?" Her head lolled weakly to the side, and she blinked at me, her eyes red and glassy. "It's not," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not me." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Her gaze darted toward the stairs. The one upstairs. "It's not me. You have to." She winced, her entire body convulsing in pain. That's when I noticed the restraints. Her wrists and ankles were bound to the beam with thick metallic chains that looked impossibly heavy. They weren't just wrapped around her. They dug into her flesh, leaving deep, angry welts where the metal pressed against her skin. The chains were pulled so tight that her body was contorted unnaturally. Her shoulders strained and her legs twisted in ways that made me wince just looking at her. Her wrists were rubbed raw, the flesh torn and bleeding where she must have struggled to free herself. I grabbed at the bindings, trying to pull them free, but they wouldn't budge. "I'm going to get you out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "I promise." Her hand reached out weakly, brushing against my arm. Her nails were chipped and bloody, her fingers trembling. "Go," she whispered. "Please, before it knows." I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll be back," I said firmly. "I'll get help." I scrambled up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top and stepped into the hallway, I froze. Standing at the front door, keys in hand, was Emma. She was smiling, her hair perfect, her makeup untouched, looking every bit like she had when she left for work. "Hey," she said brightly, kicking off her shoes. "You're still in your pajamas? Must be nice to have the day off." My mouth went dry. "Yeah," I managed to say, forcing a smile. "Just relaxing." She walked over, gave me a quick hug, and then headed to the couch. "I'm going to lay down for a bit," she said, stifling a yawn. "Long day." I watched her settle in, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't let her suspect anything. Not yet. "Do you need anything?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She shook her head. "Nope. I'm good." I nodded, heading upstairs as casually as I could manage. Once in the bedroom, I grabbed my phone and bolted back downstairs. She was still on the couch, her eyes closed, breathing steadily. "I'm going to run to the store," I said, my hand already on the doorknob. "Do you want anything?" She didn't even open her eyes. "No, I'm fine." I stepped outside, closing the door softly behind me. The moment I was off the porch, I broke into a sprint. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, my chest heaving as I dialed 911. "There's someone in my house," I said, my voice shaking. "And I'm not sure who or what she really is." The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 squad cars pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing, but they kept their sirens off. I stayed a few blocks away, watching from the shadows, too terrified to go back inside. I called the dispatcher again, explaining everything as calmly as I could, urging them to check the basement. I didn't tell them about Emma, or the thing pretending to be her. I didn't know how to explain it. After what felt like hours, an officer called me. "Sir, we're at your residence. You need to come back." I hesitated, clutching my phone tightly. Did you check the basement? We need you to return home so we can discuss this, he said firmly. My legs felt like lead as I walked back to the house. By the time I reached the porch, my palms were slick with sweat, and my heart was hammering in my chest. One of the officers met me at the door, his expression grim. "We found her," he said quietly. A cold wave of dread washed over me. "What do you mean?" He gestured for me to follow him. Another officer stayed with me as we descended the stairs. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, choking the air. At the bottom of the basement, I saw two officers standing by the support beam, their faces pale. And then I saw her. Emma, the real Emma, was dead, brutally, savagely murdered. Her body had been unshackled from the inhumanly strong metallic chains that once bound her to the beam. They lay discarded nearby, twisted and bent in ways that seemed impossible, as though something with immense power had brutally freed her from the chains only to inflict an even greater horror. She was now slumped forward, her head hanging limply. Her chest had been torn open, exposing her ribs and what little remained of her internal organs. Blood pooled beneath her, thick and dark, staining the concrete floor. One of her arms was missing, severed at the shoulder with a jagged, uneven cut. Her face, already battered and bruised, was frozen in an expression of pain and terror, her mouth slightly open as if she had been screaming. The cuts and bruises I had seen earlier were deeper now, more pronounced, as though she had endured hours of unimaginable suffering. I fell to my knees, my stomach lurching. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The officer behind me placed a hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. How could this have happened? I had just seen her alive. I had spoken to her. Who did this? I managed to choke out. The officer's grip on my shoulder tightened. "We don't know yet, but there's no sign of forced entry. We need to secure the area and conduct a thorough investigation." I looked back at the mutilated body of the woman I loved. The image burned into my mind, every detail vivid and horrifying. My thoughts spiraled. If this was Emma, then who was upstairs? After everything that happened, I couldn't stay in that house. The sight of Emma's body, the twisted chains, the metallic smell, none of it would leave me. I packed up what little I could and moved back in with my parents. They didn't ask many questions, sensing that whatever had happened was beyond explanation. I spent weeks locked in my childhood room, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of it all. The police conducted their investigation, but they found nothing to explain the horror in the basement. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. The thing that had killed Emma, whatever it was gone. The officers didn't press me about what I had seen. I think they chalked it up to trauma, the ramblings of a man who had lost the woman he loved in the most gruesome way imaginable. I let them believe it because the truth was worse. I didn't have answers for them. I barely had answers for myself. But the questions wouldn't stop. How could something mimic Emma so perfectly? Her mannerisms, her voice, the way she looked at me, every detail was flawless. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had taken Emma's place was gone for good. But late at night, as I lay awake in my old bed, a new fear crept into my mind. I started noticing little things about my parents, small inconsistencies, My dad's laugh seemed different, hollow. My mom's cooking didn't taste quite the same as I remembered. Their hugs felt off, as if they were trying too hard to be comforting. And then I thought about Emma. The fake Emma. How perfect she had seemed. How I hadn't noticed anything was wrong until it was too late. Now I can't help but wonder, has it already replaced someone else in my life?